Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with news on what the CDC's advice is when compared to the World Health Organization and how some of these contradictions come about. The most common contradiction at the minute is primarily that around who should be tested for the CCP virus. The World Health Organization believes everybody should be tested, but the CDC, at least in an earlier report from this week's, believes that testing should only be done for those who have demonstrated some sort of symptom. This has been carefully phrased as do not necessarily need a test, meaning there is room for movement within the scope of what the CDC believes is appropriate. The disconnect between the two isn't necessarily all that important until you consider that both symptomatic and asymptomatic infections can shed and transmit the virus, sometimes to the same degree. Testing of those who are asymptomatic could be an important way of figuring out where some of the infections that are occurring, and particularly hotspots, where there is no obvious stimulant or at least initial case. This is why in some countries we're seeing outbreaks that can't be traced to any given cause. This means those who are known to be sick haven't ever come into contact with someone in that area, yet these areas suddenly have a mass outbreak. The likely culprits are those without symptoms, and this means testing of individuals who don't demonstrate any need for testing may be appropriate, but when you are considering that there are limited supplies, test kits are necessarily slow to deploy, given they need to be housed, stored and moved appropriately, and then getting those results back to people even if they are being done, all takes time and resources that may not be available in all cases. The universal testing regime might be beneficial if it were feasible and affordable. At the moment, this is not necessarily true in all countries, and in most developed countries where, at least financially, it could be an option, the test kits aren't there yet. Hopefully, in the very near future, they might be. While on the topic of infections, we may be able to figure out why it is men and women are affected significantly differently when it comes to the CCP virus. There is a significant distinction between how many men and women have been hit by this, and this has been a picture that was obvious from the very beginning of the pandemic. When we look at this, older men were more likely to die than women of the same age. Now, as a general rule, women tend to have a better immune system for most of their life, and then men tend to be slightly worse off. This alone shouldn't account for the fact that there is nearly a 2-to-1 ratio of deaths from the CCP virus, and that this means men account for nearly 60% of all the fatalities. That is nearly 1 million people who've died from CCP virus, and over 600,000 of those would be male. What the researchers found is that men don't develop the same immunological response as women do. To put it in other words, more clinically, women would mount a more robust immune response using T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are what are used to remove viruses. If men weren't having the same immunological response, then they weren't able to clear it as quickly or as effectively. This matches with what we generally understand with immunology between the two sexes. Further to that cellular part of this, men would also have greater cytokine activity. Cytokine activity would lead to inflammation. Inflammation could then cause more damage. This means that men weren't clearing the virus as quickly. They were having a more serious inflammation response, and that inflammation response could cause damage. This means that they were likely to experience that damage for longer periods of time. That damage ultimately could have proven more harmful, if not fatal, for men compared to women. These results should be taken with a grain of salt. After all, there were only about 100 patients involved, but it is consistent with other immunological and clinical information that we know. While on the topic of those who are likely to be infected, we have some interesting and somewhat entertaining news. The band Smash Mouth recently held a concert, and this concert has now been linked to nearly 100 cases of the CCP virus. That is, a concert, a large, generally active affair with lots of people in close proximity, has been linked to a major outbreak. Somehow this isn't surprising. The lead singer, Steve Harwell, is said to have stated during the concert, "Now we all here tonight and we're being human once again. That COVID shit." Well, unfortunately, these are not magical words. They do not scare away the CCP virus, and in fact, it appears the CCP virus is somewhat petty and vindictive, having now led to many infections from that statement and the context in which it was given. While that was all about new infections, there are also reports of reinfections, and this has occurred in a number of different countries. Initially, there were reports based in Hong Kong. Further reports came out of Belgium and the Netherlands. This means that there is a good chance that at least 3 cases in 3 different countries in different parts of the world, for the most part, have been able to exhibit cases where people were reinfected, and this has been a concern, both because of the efficacy of vaccines and whether or not those who have been infected the first time will contribute to herd immunity. This sort of information is what will guide our selection and utilization of vaccines. New information should be taken with some wariness. As we've mentioned previously, the concern with any vaccine, and in fact any infection, is that you may not rally a sufficient immune response to develop long-term immunity. If you have a vaccine, you may require multiple doses for this reason. This means that those who have been infected with the CCP virus to date may still be vulnerable to reinfection if the initial immune response was not sufficient to retain that memory of it. Then there are concerns about what would happen if the virus began mutating, similar to what is happening with influenza each year. This concern appears to be well vindicated in both the Dutch and Belgian cases. In both instances, they were either elderly and therefore immunocompromised, or had not had a significant reaction to the first infection. This would theoretically support the argument that their body had simply not developed a memory, and so it had yet to develop a means of resisting the virus reinfecting them. This is not so with the Hong Kong case, where it was a 33-year-old man who should have been relatively healthy and therefore able to deal with the virus by mounting a proper immune response. The second time he'd been infected, after having been diagnosed the first time, he presented with minimal symptoms by comparison. This means that his second infection may not have been as serious. What this does mean is that any government looking to buy the licensing for any vaccine for the CCP virus needs to be mindful of its long-term benefits, particularly the method of action for the vaccine. If a new vaccine is reliant on a particular part of the CCP virus that is prone to mutation, and that particular mutation occurs, it may render any current vaccine moot. That means the vaccine method by which it is produced needs to be at least flexible enough that it can be modified relatively quickly for the newest batch of the virus, thereby allowing them to continue using it for several years through repeated rollouts. As we currently anticipate, this will be necessary with the ebb and flow of viral infections. The alternative is something like a fire that will simply burn through society in one massive hit. But if we're getting reinfections, and this in combination with a vaccine that may be moot, there are some concerns that need to be balanced in any government's consideration of a particular vaccine license. While on the topic of vaccines, we should talk about how anti-vaxxers are suing Facebook, and they are claiming that fact-checking is in fact a form of censorship. Yes, somehow or other, the anti-vaxxers, who at least are notoriously not particularly bright, seem to be under the impression that because what they're claiming is being checked, they are now being censored. Yeah, you're free to say whatever you want, but it doesn't leave you free from repercussions, and in this case, the repercussions are people calling out your bullshit. At least one of these groups has been spearheaded by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and has been put into the federal court in California. The anti-vaxxer groups behind this are claiming that the actions by Facebook in censoring and or checking them have caused injury. They further claim that it will cause further injury by damaging its trade reputation, goodwill, and diverting traffic from its site. This will then affect its revenue and donations. Admittedly, we feel no sympathy for them if it's going to hurt them financially and prevent people from being duped. The argument from the anti-vaxxer cohort in this case has been that their opinions about vaccines are comparable to the way climate change denialism is an opinion, and since climate change denialism is not treated adversely, and is in fact exempted from some of the fact-checking processes, then they should be given the same sort of treatment. We'll see how this pans out in the future, but it's likely to end very quickly and very unpleasantly for the anti-vaxxers. While the possibility of a vaccine coming out soon is relatively high, the question has been who would get it first. The CDC has issued some ideas as to who it thinks should be at the forefront, and what priorities would be. The one that's obvious is those who are frontline medical workers. People they think are likely to be infected by it and affected by it. That is, who's likely to be hit the hardest, the soonest, and provide the greatest benefit if they recover. Doctors, nurses, and similar are going to be in that category. The simple reality is, someone with the CCP virus is going to go to a doctor. They're going to get treatment. Now, if the doctors aren't available, you're not going to get the same kind of treatment because they're simply not able to provide it. Therefore, treating doctors means you have a constant body of people who can treat more people. Based on this, they then look at who else should be given treatment. They then looked at who else, and the first and obvious one is the elderly. We previously mentioned that the CCP virus is having the most serious effect amongst the elderly. After this, they're looking at those with long-term disabilities, illness, and similar. Those are the people likely to also have another increased risk of severe repercussions from CCP viral infection. In approximate order, this would treat 1% of the population, then the next 8% of the population would be given priority, then 15%, and then the final remaining 76% of the population. It would be a graduated rollout based on an existing method they have and policy. This is the policy for the scarce influenza vaccines if it ever came to that situation. And to a certain extent, you could argue that since the coronavirus for the influenza and for the CCP virus are related, the policy is applicable and stands to reason. While waiting for a vaccine, we're currently having to rely on other treatment options. One of these has been what you could call convalescent plasma therapy. It's a relatively old and not particularly commonly used treatment now, but at least during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, it was a common treatment. This is why we can rely on it to some extent now, and since the FDA has finally given an approval, it can be rolled out on a large scale. The idea is this: you get infected with the CCP virus, and you get sick for a little while and recover. The more serious the illness you experience, the more antibodies you develop in your plasma. This is what will recognize the virus and allow the body to target it more effectively. If you were to take plasma out of someone who has been relatively sick, put it into someone who has the virus but isn't responding as effectively, they themselves might have a more effective immune response to the virus. One caveat to this is that the plasma therapy, although effective, is only effective if given in the early stages of infection. This is because it can fundamentally reduce the longevity and severity of the infection by activating the immune system early on and rallying it to have a stronger response, fundamentally removing the virus in the body before it has time to become more established and last longer, having greater effect on the host. The difficulty with this treatment is many-fold, but the big one is this: you need to have the same blood type to start with, but you also need to donate blood, from which plasma can then be extracted. Now, as a general rule, there is a shortage of blood, particularly in America, but across the globe. This means that getting enough serum in order to do this effectively is going to be difficult, especially since those who are infected often aren't allowed to be blood donors. There has been at least one study with 35,000 records used in it. They found that if you were less than 80 and weren't a severe case, receiving plasma in the early stages of infection, that is within 3 days of a diagnosis, would reduce the probability of mortality by 35%. That means there's a 35 or nearly a 1/3 reduction in the likelihood of dying if you get given serum therapy. Another study found that this could be as high as 57%. While not related to the CCP virus, another virus has just been officially eradicated from Africa, or at least it has been eradicated from the wild. The World Health Organization has announced this week that Africa is free of a wild polio virus. The polio virus, or more commonly simply known by the disease polio, has been a scourge on the world for decades, if not centuries. We've been working for a long time to try and get rid of it, to some success in most countries, but in Africa it's been particularly difficult. Africa is a large place, and transporting vaccines around is difficult. That marks the fact that removing it from the wild is a huge achievement, and something we should be celebrating. The vaccine itself was created by Jonas Salk, and the guy could have patented it, made a fortune, and lived happily. Instead, he basically made it free to the world. Admittedly, pharmaceutical companies still had to manufacture it, and they do charge for that, but they can't charge for licensing it, which means compared to other vaccines it is substantially cheaper. And given that for a long time polio was found everywhere, and it wasn't until the 90s that we eradicated it from the developed countries, and now in the 2020s eradicated it from Africa, you can see how hard it's been to remove. But it's also worth noting that in some places polio is coming back, particularly developed countries. While that's worth celebrating, we want to go now to a case study where something bizarre and interesting has happened. A man was being tattooed, and after that happened, he had inflamed eyes and lost his hearing. Now, you might think, how are these related? After all, many people get tattoos, and, in most cases, the worst that happens is infection. In this case, something slightly more interesting and unusual occurred. The man himself was a 35-year-old male in Japan, and what he developed was a rare but interesting condition known as sarcoidosis. Sarcoidosis is where the immune cells build up in the eye, and these are called granulomas. These granulomas are what was interfering with his vision. What also happened was that these granulomas were building up in his ear. This is what caused his hearing loss. The reason you can link a tattoo to both his eye problems and hearing problems is not an uncommon phenomenon. The metals used in inks can cause an immune response, and these can, in some cases, lead to skin lesions. Now, it's not uncommon. What's uncommon is to see them not only carry on for so long after the fact, but spread to other locations. Thankfully, it's very easily treated, and that is a course of corticosteroids. This would clear up the granulomas. It removed both those affecting the tattoo, which was clearing up the metals involved in the ink, and also those in his eyes and ears. Finally, we have some developments with the various lawsuits against Bayer. Bayer is the company that bought out Monsanto, and they are being sued over their primary weed killer, known as glyphosate. It goes by the trade name Roundup. In recent months, they've been sued by a variety of people within America. Most of these lawsuits have been rolled into one major class action, and the judge overseeing this has now stated they're concerned that Bayer could be engaging in unethical conduct when it comes to the settlement process. The court case is currently on hold while Bayer and the various law firms involved try to figure out what they can do to settle this as a reasonable solution. Bayer is currently offering $11 billion in that settlement package. This makes sense from a purely pragmatic point of view. $11 billion may well be cheaper than all of the individual costs associated with litigation for this. The June began being brokered in June, and ideally it would be moving forward, but we're talking about a lot of money, a lot of individual cases, and then the class action lawsuit. There are some lawyers looking at this and saying that even if the class action were to be moving forward into a court case, their individual cases would be settled, and they'd be quite happy in engaging in those negotiations. Many of these lawsuits follow from a decision last year to award a large amount of money to an individual who had taken the company to court. They won through a jury verdict, and there has been some response to this we've covered in the past. In short though, at the moment, Bayer is also appealing that and other decisions that have occurred since, and they may have an effect on what happens when it comes to the current settlement negotiations. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting or useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.